Thanks very much. And thanks for the two speakers that we've already had. I feel as if I don't need to be here because you kind of said what I was going to say. So that's all good. I want you to just imagine, and based on some of what's already been said, something about the journey to be where we are, how you envision the structure of education, and in particular the structure of higher education. And we've had 3 talks today, but before those talks you had your own experiences about what it is we're in, an idea of radical education, and what is that? For me, there's something there about why are we speaking about radical education or radical pedagogies? And this idea about the small voices, I wanted to think about, or I have spent a lot of time thinking about the notions about who am I, and Raj in terms of talking about epistemology or her positionality, and we all are never far from our positionality. Some of us, we're very aware of it, and some of us are not. Yeah, even though it impacts on the way in which we are and the way in which we live our lives, consciously or subconsciously. Kanye talked about how we learn to hate ourselves, and the accounts in terms of part of what Lillian talked about and part of what Raj talked about in terms of a punchback kind of sometimes leads you to that place in which you can begin to think that you're the fault, you're the reason, it's your problem. Yeah, it's not a problem of the institution, or it's not a problem of society. It's how it is. So it comes back to you. And it was really quite telling in terms of the last point you made, in terms of, not the last point you made, but the point you made about the institution and how institutions protect themselves, yeah, in terms of it pushes it back to you. So the question that we begin to look at in terms of education or radical education and the narratives that come up within that often comes back to, where can I have this conversation? Where can I have that conversation, and for that conversation to be legitimate? Because actually you operate, or I feel as if we operate in a very distrusting location. Very, very difficult to have those kind of conversations. And so the idea, in me speaking about small voices, actually was a term that came out of the research that I was undertaking, where some students said, I know there are people who want to have these conversations, but they're the small voices. They don't feel able to have those conversations. Some of them was uncertain as whether they could even have the conversation with me, because after all, part of my positionality is I'm a servant of the institution, yeah, and the institution is perceived in particular ways, and we can't be very far from that. The idea of today, when we speak about narratives, I had to put this up but we're bombarded with narratives and the idea of stress and the ways in which these different things are impacting on us. A person's inability to cope with everyday life, such as school, work, or society in general. And I think that the institution of education, the institution of higher education, is never far from society in general. It is society. Yeah? And we need to be very aware, very mindful of such things. I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but I really just wanted to draw attention to this particular slide. And I wanted to draw attention to this slide to indicate something in regards to what I see as the seriousness of what we're in. Because post-traumatic stress is something that many... so I'm coming back to the word that you struggle to say. I don't talk about BAME and I don't talk about BME. I talk about ethnically minoritized people, because I believe it to be a process that is taking place, that I don't see myself as a minority in itself, I see myself more as a majority. However, I'm a part of a group that has been minoritized, and that in itself is not a neutral thing that is taking place, it is an active thing that is taking place, and we can choose to take that on or not. Nonetheless, we're in a situation in which many of us are experiencing trauma in the ways in which we live our lives, in the way in which we experience our lives. And some of that may be latent, and some of that might be expressed and articulated in many different ways. And yet we don't feel able to have these conversations. And these are really important conversations, and despite many initiatives that's out there to say, come and talk, yeah, it's the last thing that some of us will do, because it's another label that you don't want to carry, that we don't want to carry, yeah. So this aspect of what is going on for us is really important. I was reminded from the talks that we've had so far that it's really interesting that I don't spend, well maybe I do, but maybe it's part of the latent me, is that I spent more time thinking about the experience of students. It was the experience of students that stimulated my interest in and my direction in study and coming back into higher education. As a student myself, as a minoritized student, I didn't feel that my student days was happy days. Later on, I thought maybe they actually were. Do you know how when you're in it in the moment in which you're in it, you love to hate it? But later on, subsequently, yeah, it was okay. Nonetheless, the experience was traumatic for me. And I now reflect on how traumatic it must be for some students. Yet, simultaneously, I'm wondering where I have shifted along that line in regards to what is it that's going on for those minoritized students that's coming into our situations of higher education. And this is a point about where I am in this moment. Because where I am in this moment, it's like beginning to challenge myself in relation to what do I actually believe the experience to be for those minoritized students. And by that, I guess I'm saying, I'm seeing so many of our minoritized students coming into institutions of higher education and living in accordance with some idea of this is who you are and this is how you must be. And Raj talked about the idea of shame, and some of those communities from which those communities are coming from, those students are coming from, would be ashamed of the ways in which some of those students are behaving. There's something in terms of, if you like, an assimilation that is taking place in an aspiration to whiteness. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense, but that process begins to make, on the one hand, prioritizing whiteness and saying that's how I must be, and beginning to ape that kind of behavior. It's not actually a great expression, but mimic, copy that behavior. Does that kind of make some sense?
Absolutely.
And there's something in there that really causes, coming back to the point I made in terms of hating yourself. You try so hard to be somebody else. You become disconnected from who you are and those aspects that have been there as your safety net. And that's a real problem for me when I'm actually working with minoritized students, because I'm sometimes asking the question, where is this coming from? Yeah, and sometimes I'm looked at in terms of almost like there's a side. Whose side are you on? Yeah, and it picks up the point that you've both made in terms of whose side are you on. And I guess for me, I still am on my side, which means that I'm not going to collude with you, and I'm not going to collude with the system of education that will fail you when it's telling you it's doing right by you. Yeah. And far too many of our students are coming through and are failed in the systems that we're working through. That becomes of the small voices. It also becomes part of the blame game in terms of whose fault is this as to where I am in this process. And so we look for someone to scapegoat or for someone to blame for what is actually taking place in regards to this. If you've read the abstracts, you've already read that. So for me, we're talking about trauma, and as a part of this process, the tragedy is of the unfulfilled lives for those we live with, and the untapped potential and uncontrolled blur of mental trauma. For me, that's a part of what I felt that I saw often. I came into this field because I felt that there were many, many minoritized students, including myself, who could have done better and didn't, and who was struck with this feeling of not being good enough. And that feeling, good enough, I'm at the height of, I've already overachieved in terms of what I was expected to achieve. and still you feel not good enough. And that's kind of real something that you carry with you in so many different ways. And guess what? There are so many people around you who will constantly make you feel not good enough. Yeah? And that's really important in terms of these ideas of who we are. I put this up because for me it's really interesting, and it's like we talk about some of these as if they're news, and they're not. You know, Woodson, 1933, was talking about miseducation. And miseducation continues to be one of those processes. I would argue that we're still highly involved in miseducation. And I would go as far as saying that grade inflation and the direction of travel that many universities are following today is a part of this miseducation. And it's really, for me, it's really problematic, yeah, because it disproportionately affects different groups, yeah. So we have to begin to say, stand up for what we really believe to be a quality education. And we shouldn't actually expect education to be less great for someone because of their class, because of their gender, because of their ethnicity. We should demand that there's a great education for everyone who comes into it. We should not collude with the systems of education that allows poor people to stay poor and to feel as if they've achieved when they actually have not. Yeah? I think these are real problems that we must face in our education systems today. And I think it's shameful, frankly. I think it's shameful the way we've moved in education today. Hilliard talks about a bondage, mental bondage as invisible violence. And in particular, it is the person the person who is in mental bondage will be self-contained. You stay in a place that you have been almost dictated, destined to be within that. So you begin to talk, you begin to come back. If you mentioned Fanon, and Fanon picks this idea up, how you become the person who others has determined that you must be. And if your education has not assisted you, and if your communities have not helped you, and if the wider communities dictate that this is how things are, that becomes a part of who you are going forward. So I'm putting these up just to illustrate some degree of context relative to what it is we feel, or what it is I feel we're up against. I picked this quote up from Harris, who talked about radical pedagogy is concerned with how knowledge and education can be or should be changed to best serve the needs of educators, students, and society at large. And I guess for all of these, I wanted us to have a conversation about this, because does that really indicate what radical education is, or radical pedagogies are? And actually, what is right or what is wrong with this statement, or any of these statements? Because as I read these statements, I suddenly thought, yeah, I can agree with that, but actually there's a problem here. And you kind of go all the way through these, and I kept seeing some problems with these. Is that making some kind of sense? Because I'm going through this, I'm thinking, okay, and society at large. Okay, well, society at large is, excuse my shit. Really? So, what are you preparing people for? What, to fit into that? Or to challenge that? Yeah? What are we doing? And I have to say that part of me feels that's part of the wider collusion in terms of the ways in which our university structures and the ways in which our education structures have fallen into that. So they're kind of just repeating the same kind of process as we're going through. But they're selling it to you. I grew up in the Caribbean. Well, I grew up until I was 10 in the Caribbean. We had something like we called sugar. And where I come from, we had brown sugar. And I'm part of that Windrush generation. So we had brown sugar. But we didn't like brown sugar because we was told white sugar was best. And now it's coming back to brown sugar. You'll take it from you, wrap it up, and then sell it back to you. You know, they've got these strange things that's kind of going on with this. And we have to understand that the structure of oppression, or bigger structures, sometimes do that. Yeah? And you have to discover somewhere where you are within this. I needed more time to do this talk.
Is that enough?
Have I got a choice? So in regards to parts of where we teach, as you said, I've been doing this for a long time. And one of the things we did in terms of the course, and I have to say, in spite of all that I said about higher education, I'm fortunate in that I work in a division which is youth and community work. And youth and community workers are notorious for doing something otherwise. Yeah? So you tell us it's going to be this way, we'll say, all right. And then we'll do what we want anyway. And so for me, I'm fortunate in that I've grown up in that space. And one of the things that we did, there were 3 youth and community institutions, ourselves, Manchester, and I can't remember the other one, who set up Black Perspectives courses, and we've maintained those courses. In spite of, you can't say black, or you can't do this, or it's going to cause a problem, we did that. And from the narratives from students, it comes back and it says, sometimes it's a very profound impact on people's learning beyond the course. And for me, that for me is a part of what we're talking about when we speak about, I don't even want to use the term radical education. I've spent a lot of time thinking about radical education. And I actually want to talk about transformative education. Because radical education is radical for the moment, just because something is probably not great and we move it on and then it becomes normal. Yeah? And for me, let's talk about transformative education. Let's talk about education that makes a difference, that makes a change, that challenges the structures of oppression, going forward. Because I think that is part of what we need for our times, and that's a part of what we need going forward. The quote from Bell Hooks is about learning to transgress, and actually envisioning the environment, the space that we occupy, the space that we're in has unlimited potential if we're prepared to link up, join up, and make that difference. I have a whole set of recommendations I can make. But guess what? Nobody wants to listen to me. So you come here and you have these little conversations, but within the structure, people have already determined who they want to have those conversations with. And sometimes, some of those persons they want to have the conversations with come into spaces like this, tell you that you're shit, and then go out and have a conversation with somebody else, and they take that idea and say, wow, that's wonderful, that's cool, we'll do that. So, in terms of thinking about those narratives, it kind of becomes really important in terms of how you situate yourself relative to how you are situated and what needs to be done in relation to be doing that. For me, I certainly feel that we need to create more dialogue. I think it's essential that we create dialogue, and I think it's essential that we create different systems in terms that challenges the hierarchy that maintains the system as they are currently. I believe my time is up, but if you want to give me more time, like another half hour.
You have 2 more minutes left, but if you want to...
No, let's talk. Let's just talk. Let's just talk.
Take into question and
I
answer.
mean, what am I going to do in 2 minutes? Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation.
Okay. So, round of applause.